Today I'm joined by Suzie Forbes, occupational therapist, mental health practitioner, and the founder of the Wonderful Society, a platform providing coaching support to parents as they navigate raising their children. As a mum of four, I know I've definitely felt the guilt that comes with parenting and the minefield of ways you can go wrong. But why are some children more difficult to parent than others? How can we best parent neurodiverse children and support our kids when they're experiencing big emotions? In this conversation, we discuss values-based parenting and what this actually means in practice. Do timeouts actually work? How can we encourage children to persist with tasks they aren't interested in? Suzie shares so many helpful tips and tricks that will be useful for many parent or future parent out there. Let's get into it. Suzie, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I'm super excited about this one. As a mum of four children, I'm always up for hints and tips. But it would be lovely if you could introduce yourself to everyone and tell us a little bit about you and your journey.
Yes, so thank you so much for having me on, Dr. Shauna. I'm very excited to be here on All About You. So I have been a pediatric occupational therapist working with children, young people, their families, and their communities. So I've done a lot of school-based work as well for 30 years. So I'm also a mental health care practitioner, clinician, and I have been since the Medicare rollout of the Better Access to Mental Health program. I actually helped facilitate training for GPs when that rolled out about how that was going to be used in Bayside, Melbourne. And I've been lucky enough to work with, children, their families, and their supporting teams aged from a few weeks old. So teaching baby massage and supporting mamas in that very new state, all the way through to young adults getting jobs and moving into the world of work as well. Um, I'm now working as a mental health practitioner and also a DI specialist, a disability inclusion specialist in a public secondary school here in Victoria. And I've also shifted my private practice from direct intervention to parent coaching. And part of the reason for that is I've spent so many years so passionate about mental health of our children and teenagers and young people. And I really feel the key to this is to empowering parents. And I feel schools now doing a really amazing job integrating this into systems and talking to external systems and supports to get that going. But I think often parents are still left on the sidelines, and I think there's a real opportunity for them to be empowered and to build those skills. So if you're okay, I just wanted to tell a little story about myself and my family. Is that all right, Shauna?
Please do. I'd love that.
So that's kind of my professional background, if you like. But I think for me, my most proud achievement is really raising the generally happy, healthy, helpful, most of the time, humans that are my son and daughter at this point. And, it's interesting because I really specialize in supporting parents that have children with big emotions, and both my children have very big emotions. So I have a very passionate, I call her lion-hearted daughter. She was born with fire in her belly. Like she was 5 days late and she just lifted her head up and she's like, look out world, the day she was born. She's very driven and focused, and I know one day that will look like success, great success and leadership. She's very passionate about ocean conservation and those sorts of things now, but actually parenting her as a little person and through most of her childhood with her very high spirit, very high energy, took a lot of intentional work and specific strategies of survival, if that makes sense. But now I can see how that's being directed. So her energies are no longer being directed towards, possibly lighting fires. And that was always my terror for her, that she was going to be this very angry person. And she's not at all. She's using that power now. And then my eldest, she's 16 now. And then my eldest son, who is highly sensitive, highly creative, highly intelligent. I call him a highly perceptive young person. And I've seen a lot of these children over the years and years that I've done this work. And pretty much parenting him, I've always felt like I'm holding a sword and he's balancing on the top of it. And I'm trying to get that balance of pushing him enough that he can build confidence, but also backing off enough so that the stress levels stay out of a toxic zone. Highly empathic, and again, born like that. Um, I have lost a lot of sleep over his 20 years, and every now and again that flares up, but we've got systems and strategies now so that we can manage it more quickly and easily. And because of their expressions and their temperament, this amplified my own triggers and it spiraled my own big emotions too. So I'm really passionate about talking to parents around that sort of spiral that we can go into, because our kids, of course, seem to just know that little button to push that can make us feel really stressed, anxious, angry, frustrated. And I think it's a universal parenting experience, really, that, our children seem to know when we feel stressed and they become more clingy. And I think there's actually, the science I've read, there's actually some evolutionary benefit to that for our little ones. But if they don't grow out of it, it becomes very frustrating for parents. So when my kids were really little, I was a single mum when they were quite young, and we had a bit of trauma around that, but which I think enhanced these big emotions that were being played out for them and also for me. Um, but, my son was really, really clingy, and I worried that he would never do anything without me there supporting him and doing those sorts of things, that he'd never even sleep in his bed by himself, that, he would never be able to go to school without crying for 2 hours. A lot of those things were worrying to me, and what his teenage and young adult years would look like. And then I had this daughter who, if it wasn't her way, it was no way, with her little hands on her hips, telling me all about it. And, I was often exhausted. I was often overwhelmed. I, was second guessing myself. And I can actually remember a time when they were really little and I broke down and I was crying, and I hid myself in the bedroom and sat by the door so that they couldn't get in and see how distressed I was. And I was really quite, the way I was talking to myself, I would never talk to another human being like that. I was pretty much beating myself up. So, and then on top of that, because I was already an OT, right, and I had already 15 years into my pediatric work that I'd been doing, and I knew all these principles. And I was sort of at the start of my mental health work probably at that point, but I really just didn't feel good enough. And I didn't feel like I was doing enough in my business, even though I had therapists that were working for me and I was supervising them. And it was a really thriving practice where we were supporting hundreds and hundreds of families, and privileged enough to do so. I was worried about that all the time. And I was still very hyper focused on the fact that I wasn't enough as a mom. And so I sat there and I was really distressed, and I thought, you know what? I need to stop this. I need to stop all this negative talk, and I need to actually talk to myself like I would if a mum had walked into my office. And I took a breath and I thought, well, I'd start with where her strengths were. And my strengths were building connection. So I had some really good friends, and I was really good at building connections and communities. I'd never asked for help before. And I needed to be able to lean into that and actually ask for help for the first time. I was a lone wolf just doing all this stuff on my own. And when I started asking for help, I actually found a beautiful counselor who was also a life coach. And I did a lot of work on myself and my not enoughness. And this is a lot of the work I do with families now, because for me, and certainly for a lot of the families I've worked with, it seems that, you know, the difficulties for our kids often start with us, and that there's a real strong dyad, especially when our children are young, with how we're feeling and how they're responding as well. And that gives us power. That means we can do something about that, from that ground up. It takes work and it takes support, but we can actually shift that in a really meaningful, intentional way. So I did pull on my big girl pants and I did that. And I also did a lot more of my continuing education. I finished my graduate diploma in psychology, And I did a lot more study in neuroscience and neurobiology of these big emotions of executive functioning and trauma informed and all of this sort of work. And what has happened is over time, I've been able to sort of think down systems that, not just for me, but for the beautiful families that I've been privileged enough to work with, I've been able to work out, sort of distill it down and work out what works powerfully, what's possible, what's sustainable, because some of the research evidence-based things are fantastic ideas, but they're not sustainable for families that are busy and stressed and doing a lot of things. And really, this was amazing because it didn't just help me and my children, but it helped these families, most of which have children that are, have challenging behaviors and really big emotions playing out. So, yeah, that's kind of where it sort of went to and has come to. And I've now built this beautiful program where I teach parents to storm-proof their kids, is the analogy I use, because we can't stop those storms from coming, right? They just keep coming at us.
I know, just thinking about some of the patients that I see and friends that I chat to, parenthood definitely comes with a large serving of guilt. And I think whenever you describe that feeling of not feeling enough, I think that's a big issue out there. And, talking from a mum's point of view, there's this guilt, or are your children socializing enough, and are you organizing enough activities for them, and are they having enough play dates, and are their lunch boxes healthy enough, and are they eating enough fruit and vegetables, and have you booked the dental appointments? And it's just this endless list of to-dos all the time. And I think, there's a lot of mothers and parents who are just constantly feeling stressed that they're not just sort of, I suppose, meeting the mark of what the parent that they want to be. So I think you've absolutely nailed that. So as a mum of four, I will tell you that I found parenting my first two children reasonably easy, and I patted myself on the back and thought that I was rather marvelous at parenting. I've now got four children and realized that that's potentially was more of a personality uh of the child rather than me being such a wonderful mother. But why are some children more difficult to parent than others in your experience?
Um, so there's a lot of things. First of all, I'd like to say that you're probably just a wonderful mother, full stop. And, being able to parent the children that we're given, because they are all individual, right? And this is what I often say to families is you've got to kind of meet the child where the child is, because even a child will be different. Some children are very variable. They're very inconsistent in their presentations, and it can get really challenging for a parent to stay consistent when their child is really inconsistent. Some children are more challenging than others because they have differences in temperament, as you've identified there. Um, Sometimes there might be neurodiversity sitting there that has or hasn't been identified. Sometimes there are traumas, and sometimes what we define as a trauma is not necessarily something that can be they can have traumas that have been activated and you might not even know. So it might be an ongoing bullying situation at school that you haven't necessarily found out about. That's still a trauma. That still creates trauma-based behaviors. It basically makes their stress trigger a bit tighter and it's going to go off more easily. And for some kids, it's a combination of those things. So, for example, some of our kids with neurodiversity, just going to school and being in that sensory environment can be traumatic for them. So they can have everyday trauma related to their neurodiversity in the context of being in the community or being in the school, just as an example. So it can be really variable. And the way I work is very individualized. So even in the groups, I talk to parents about them identifying what the actual underlying challenges and needs and triggers are for their child, because they're all going to be different. Just like us as adults, they're all different. Some of us don't like listening to somebody else eat next to us. Others of us don't like sticky things, sticky labels on things. We've all got our own little sensory preferences and our own self-talk, our own inner coach, inner critic sort of stuff that goes on as well. So And kids, on top of that, their little brains are still developing, their regulation's still developing. And the biggest thing that I find I work on with families to coach their kids on, so I coach the families, the parents, and then they coach the kids, is to build executive functioning skills.
So what does that mean?
So often children that have poor executive functioning skills are having trouble with things like regulation, problem solving, planning, motor planning, practice sequencing, difficulties with persisting when something gets hard, task persistence, difficulties with sustaining motivation over time to something that I'm not interested in, particularly, if that makes sense. Um, so these are all executive functions that occur in our, prefrontal lobe.
So I'd love to stop you there. I'd love some tips on that one. So getting someone to persevere with a task that they find boring. Uh, can you give us some tips for that?
Yeah, I've actually got a tool called the We Have a Problem strategy. And I actually teach it in my masterclass. I just did one last week, and I've actually got a book that goes with it that I'm happy to, we can put in the show notes that, parents can access, and you can certainly access, Dr. Shauna.
Amazing. Thank you.
Actually, I call it my fight stopping tool, but it actually teaches these it's a routine to rest in that teaches these executive functioning strategies to help us solve an actual problem that we have. So the problem might be, the child's not persisting with, what are they not persisting with, Dr. Shauna? Can you give
I'm
me an
not
example?
persisting with a chore. They're not finishing a chore that they have.
Okay, so what's the chore we're talking
Okay,
about?
unloading the dishwasher.
Yeah, I was going to go with unloading the dishwasher anyway. So, okay, so first of all, I would be considering in my mind, are they not unloading the dishwasher? Although the unloading of the dishwasher, everything's clean. So sometimes kids don't like loading the dishwasher or doing the dishes because they have sensory differences as well. But unloading the dishwasher. So I would actually use this tool, and we would identify the problem as, you've got this chore, and that's to unload the dishwasher every day, but it's not happening. And then there's a whole bunch of agreements around this that we're actually going to use our tools for calming before and as we need to during the conversation. We're going to speak kindly to each other. And we're actually going to persist together to come up with a solution. And pretty much the fun stops until we can actually solve this problem. I actually had this tool in this very blue folder when my kids were little. And when I got the blue folder out, and I know if you're just listening on podcast, you can't actually see it, but if when I got the blue folder out, my children very quickly would go, "Oh, but we have a problem tool's coming," and they would start to solve problems. So I started this when my kids were about 2 and 5. Two's probably a little bit young for most kids, but I modified the language considerably for my daughter, and she was able to participate. By the time they were sort of 5 and 8, they were doing this very independently and able to actually come up with solutions themselves. So then we actually come up with a series of brainstorm solutions. And as the parent, we write them down or we draw them for them. And, I always say, make sure you're putting on there every crazy idea that your child comes up with. Get that child's voice on that piece of paper. And to be honest, sometimes my kids came up with solutions that were amazing that I would not have. And I've had other parents tell me the same thing when they use this tool. So you actually just brainstorm a whole bunch of solutions to this problem. It might be that, Mum, you're going to remind me, or I'm going to set a timer on my iPad, or I'm not going to open my iPad or my, gaming device until I've done this, or I'm going to, but let them come up with it, because if it's come from them, they're much more likely to then persist with it. And then you also go through that, decide what you can agree on together, and then you have that agreement. And then you also come up with, well, what happens if we break this agreement? What happens if Mum breaks this agreement? What happens if you break this agreement? And again, kids are really good at coming up with consequences for themselves that are fair and reasonable. It's actually surprising. You think they wouldn't do it, but they can. And the other part of it is you're just reminding them, hey, we can go and do that fun thing that you want to do as soon as we've got this solved and as soon as we're in agreement about this. So you don't have to agree to something that's unreasonable. You have to sort of come to that. but letting them lead it.
So I've got two questions for you on that. So first one is, so is it reasonable to let the person who potentially has some neurodiversity or sensory issues for them to say they can't load the dishwasher because they don't want to touch items of plates and things that have got food on them. So we have this in our house. So all my other children have had to load and unload the dishwasher. My son can't stand touching it. Of course, my older children think it's a cop out and they think I'm letting him away with it. But my compromise is that he unloads the dishwasher. Is that fair, or should we be pushing children who have a sensory issue to touch things that they don't want to touch?
Okay, so there's two questions there, really, isn't there? So the first question about the sensory needs, I would never force a child with sensory needs to touch something that they don't want to touch, because all you're actually doing, so they've already got a more sensitive system, and what you're actually doing is worsening that activation of that system every time you make that child do something that's already activating a stress response in them. And the analogy I often use when I talk to parents about that is, if you can imagine a huntsman crawling across your back, the sensation that you have with that, like a really big fat hairy spider crawling across your back, the sensation you have with that, that's the activation that our tactily defensive kids are having. So if you continue to activate that, what's actually going to happen is their frontal lobe, their thinking brain's going to disconnect. And then all those executive functions that we're trying to actually strengthen and connect with and build, they're offline. It's like they're offline. And we're just being driven by the amygdala, which is our real stress system, right? Our emotional system. And that's when you're actually going to get much more volatile meltdowns, tantrums, those sorts of things. So, no. What I would suggest, Shauna, is that you do the We Have a Problem tool with all your children as a committee. You sit down and you go, okay, we have individualized things for each of you. Each of you have preferences and not preferences. This is the list of chores that we need to get done. Um, who's going to do what, when, and how? How are we going to work this together as a team? Okay. And I'll share my experience for you. The other part that I found with my son, who is sensitive, slow to warm up, doesn't like change very much. He can adjust to change. He just needs more time and more exposure to get to that. Is that when I tried to implement a chore schedule where he and his sister and anybody else who was staying in our house, because we've had a few other kids stay in our house at times, had to exchange jobs, like say weekly or whatever, he would fight with me every time he had to do the job. He was happy to unload the dishwasher. He was actually happy to take the rubbish out. Over time, we added that. He was happy to do, like there was 3 or 4 jobs that over time as he got older, we added in, and he was happy to do those. And when they became a routine and he just did them, they just got done without conflict. And so our solution was to work to strength again. What's his strength? Once he's mastered a routine, he's really great at that. He loves that and he's willing to do it. And to this day, that's what he does in our house. He helps us with those things. Even as a 20-year-old, that's all his job. And what I did over time I layered in more and more. So he's very anxious about cooking food because, again, there's lots of sensory stuff in there, but I've taught him lots of meals now, and he does dinner one night a week and cleans the whole kitchen. And he's really, really good at it.
Okay, that's great. Susie, I know that you also mentioned trying to get the kids to come up with their own consequences. One of the consequences that comes up a lot in my practice and also with friends and kids is, parents taking phones away, taking iPads away, stopping kids from playing their computer games or whatever for X number of hours, days, weeks, whatever it happens to be. Do you have an opinion on that and whether that's a good strategy or not a good strategy?
I think all kids have a currency. So, what I mean by that is all kids have something that is really important to them. And for many kids, yes, screen time. And I could talk for hours and hours on screen time. I've got a whole module of routines, and which includes the chores and all that sort of stuff. But we actually talk about screen time for like 2 full weeks of the course because screens are a really interesting thing. So I think for me, this comes back to values-based intentional parenting. And this is the strategies that I teach and worked really well with my kids. So when I talk about values-based parenting, I mean being really aware of it, like taking a step back from the chaos of everyday parenting and being really aware of what's most important to you as a parent. So I actually have a whole bunch of exercises and worksheets that obviously we don't have time to talk about through some of those here, but um, basically, you're thinking about who's the 20-year-old that's going to walk in the door for Sunday night dinner to come visit you? What values are they going to be as a young adult, even when they're only 2 or 3 or baby or, in primary school age? Who do you want walking through the door once they're grown? And thinking about what's important to you, and then you can actually parent from there. And the reason I tell this is because the way I parented around screens was my view was very clearly, let's set a routine. You're allowed this amount of time and that's it. But I also had one of my core values was connection, still is connection. And so my kids knew that if I said, hey, I wanted to talk to them, no matter what they were doing, if they're in the middle of a game, if they're in the middle of a YouTube, if they're in the middle of messaging a friend, that they needed to acknowledge me. And they could say, I'll be a sec, I just want to finish this message. But they needed to acknowledge, Mum wants to connect, Mum wants to talk to me, or the device would be taken away for a period of time. Now, I never did very long. I usually just took it away maybe for the night, but it was based on the value of connection. And to this day, my kids walk around with one AirPod in because they know if I go, hey, and they've got to go, yes, mum, because it's trained, right? I taught them from really young, and it's like a training thing. And now it's just an automatic response, even at a 16, 17-year-old, 20-year-old level. So I think if you think about values and what that means, and in terms of me allowing them to say, give me 1 minute or let me finish this game, for me as an adult, if I'm in the middle of an email and my kids go, Mom, I'll say, give me a minute, I've got to finish this and I'll be there in a minute because I've run, businesses for years and years since they were tiny. Uh, um, so I feel like I need to be respectful and do that back and let them finish that little thought.
For anyone listening who hasn't followed a values-based parenting strategy, I'd love you to first of all explain what it is, and also, is it too late if you've already got teenagers, or can people introduce this at any stage?
It's not too late at all. You can introduce it at any stage. You could even introduce it with adults once you've already got adult families and have them bring it in. Because my children were little, I very much directed what values and I was a single parent. So I went through and I worked through myself. And I actually went through, you kind of go through a bit of an evolution because you try some on for size, and then you go, actually, that doesn't work. I need something else here. So, for example, I had connection, kindness, and compassion as my values originally. But what I found was my very sensitive boy, he was just snuggling into that, right? And not wanting to go out into the big, scary world and interact with it. Yeah. Um, and at that time, I actually read Gifts for Imperfection by Brene Brown, and I started getting into Brene Brown. And once I got into Brene Brown's work, I added bravery. So we had kindness, connection, and bravery. And that's where I parented from for the duration then from when probably my daughter was 3 or 4. So she's now almost 17. She's 17 in a couple of weeks. So no, you can start anywhere. I would suggest though, if you're going to do this with teenagers, probably from about 14, 15 plus, I would very much I would do it as a group. I would try and do those activities as a group and think through those processes as a group and whittle it down to your 3 or 4 core values as a group. With primary school age children through tweens and early, up to about 13, I would get their input, but I would still probably be leading that as the parent. So I would get them to help you highlight the ones that they like, tell you why, all of those sorts of things, and incorporate that in your thinking. But as the parent or parents together, I would still be probably directing that and then explaining to the kids, so glad to have your voice in this discussion. And this is why we've chosen these. This is what we're going to start with, and we'll see how we go from there.
Okay. And obviously, you're talking a little bit there about teenagers. Obviously, it's really important to try and keep the lines of communication going with teenagers who often go through a slight quiet and grunting phase. Have you any ideas or hints to try and keep that communication going?
So I guess there's a couple of things here that I'd like to share. One is that, teenagers, like toddlers, are going through a major brain pruning, neurobiological changes, where basically, if you think about that prefrontal lobe, which is in charge of all those executive functions, those really important executive functions that I was talking about before, um, is kind of being pruned out and the new, more sophisticated network built in. So it's like a computer upgrade, but we've pulled all the wires out so that we can then reprogram it, if you like. The analogy I use with the kids is to say to them, your little kid wardrobe, when you clean that out to then put in your young adult wardrobe, basically there's a big mess in the middle. And that's what parents are having to manage, and the kids are having to manage as well. And so even some kids that have good organizational skills, they forget them, or they lose them a bit for a little while as well, or they tend to decrease a little bit in this time as well, just as an example. So that I think being mindful of that neurobiology, and again, I like to help parents step through what's actually going on for their individual child as well within the work that I do. But the other part of it is training your kids from when they're really little to have these communication lines open is so valuable and protective. These are protective factors for when they get to these teen years. So I'll give you an example. My daughter, from when she was tiny, she worked out that the only quiet time she could really get with me was in the middle of the night. So even as an infant, she would cry and want to feed and giggle and play from 1 till 2 in the morning. I quickly worked out that that's because she was trying to get individual time with me. So I then allocated really specific time so that she could get it during the day so I could get sleep because my mental health was starting to deteriorate from lack of sleep. But she very quickly, once she could talk, she would go through this nightly grievance process. This was just her natural rhythm. And it drove me nuts, Shauna. So here's me, single mum, working all day seeing kids. Then I'm running around picking up from, daycare, childcare and kindy and school. And then, running around trying to do all the evening stuff as the mama and be the mama and listen to the reader as he goes into prep and do all of those things. Finally get them, through the bedtime routine and to sleep. And I've got 4 hours of paperwork still waiting for me before I can go to bed. Like, not time for me. I've got to finish my work day because I've literally cut it so I can be with my kids. And so I'm just sitting there going, go to sleep. She's telling me about some block tower that someone's knocked over, or somebody didn't want to play her rules in her game, or somebody else hit somebody else and it had nothing to do with her, but she was upset about it. But then I realized two things. One, if I pushed back at all, if I didn't sit and hold space for her, or I tried to fix the problem and just get it over and done with, she would escalate. And then we would have, screaming, yelling and all of that. And it would actually take much longer. So my end goal was for her to go to sleep. So what I wanted to do was some sort of action that was going to help her get through this process as quickly and as efficiently as possible, stay regulated, and then down regulate into that sleep state. But secondly, I then leant back and went, but I've made this value of connection. And when I'm connected to my daughter, I see her, I hear her, I feel what's going on for her. And remembering I'm talking about a preschooler at this stage, a 3-4-year-old at this stage. So she's just learning to regulate her emotions. These events were bringing up really big emotions for her at that time. And I needed to make space for her to express them, get them off her chest. They can sit with me. And then she could actually let go of them and go to sleep. As she got older, I gave her worry dolls, those little worry dolls, and she was able to tell the worry dolls some of the things, and then she would tell me the bigger things. But I can tell you now, still to this day, and as I said, she's 17 in 2 weeks. Um, it's much less frequent. It's much less, it doesn't go on for hours anymore usually. But this is when she'll tell me something that's happened that has upset her or was worrying her, or even if it's about a friend that she's worried about, and it happens at 9 o'clock at night. Still ready to go to sleep, ready to, so I've trained her for that. And I guess the next question is can you train? Obviously I started when she was tiny because this was what I did. And that's really effective. So if you've got little ones, definitely start training them now. You think in your mind that it's never going to be me. I'm going to have a great teenager. No, train them now while they're little so that you can have that open communication, even if they're great. So you know what's going on in their lives because the problems are much bigger and they do come in with them. But even if they're in primary school, you can start that process with them. You can start working out rhythms where you can touch base with them. With my son, it was very different. She did this herself. With my son, I used to just go shoot hoops with him for 10 minutes a day. And just that repetitive action of being side by side with him all the time, he would just tell me stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with my daughter, one of the things that I realized is there was three things I always thought of them as the three H's. She would often get into the car. I always knew with how loudly the door was banged when she got into the car what her day had been like. And there was three things she either needed me to hold a space, so just listen. Sometimes she needed help with a solution as to how to navigate something, and sometimes she needed a hug. So there was kind of three things that, and I had to learn very quickly that sometimes she didn't want me to come up with a solution. She just wanted me to agree that that teacher was really mean, or wasn't that person really mean who said that, or whatever. So it's also navigating that the person doesn't always want you to be very sort of reasonable and say, oh well, you have to see it from the teacher's point of view or whatever. Sometimes they just need you to hold that space. Um
And I think, sorry, can I just follow on from that? Because I think that that's really key. And I actually asked my daughter, particularly, do you want me to help you solve this problem or do you just want me to hold space for you? And she can tell me most of the time now. Well, she can now. Um, but besides that, one of the other things I've talked to a lot of parents about that they really like is this idea of, when our kids are really little, we walk in front of them, we kind of take them places or we hold them and we're taking them places, we're leading them. As they get a bit bigger and we're talking about tweens and stuff, we're kind of walking upper primary school, we're kind of walking beside them. But as they become teenagers, we end up walking behind them. But I always say to parents, you kind of need to stay close behind them. You can't just let them get 2 kilometers ahead of you. Um, because when they turn around and need you, because they'll only do it for briefer windows, you have to be right there and ready to receive that. And if you're not and you miss the window, they may not tell you that piece of information. So, not breathing down their neck, letting them have the space to become the independent adult that they're going to become, but really just being present there because as they are repruning and rewiring that brain, you also want to guide that to make sure those boundaries are still there, but you're giving them a bit more space to try and problem solve and work through the issues themselves but with your eyes on them, like the trapeze artist with the guy with I've got the net for you as the trapeze artist. I'm going to let you fly on your own a little bit now, but I'm right here and just keep reminding I'm right here.
Yeah, that's really helpful. What I was wanting to ask a little bit about as well, again, I see a lot of kids come in to see me in general practice, usually brought in by mum or dad who are struggling, maybe year seven, year eight at school, started high school and struggling with friends. and some of those kids have neurodiversity, but some of them haven't. Is there any help that you can give us with that? Because I know, like, again, lots of mums and dads get really worried and upset that their children maybe don't have a lot of friends or maybe struggling, and they get obviously extremely worried and sad thinking of their child going to school each day and struggling through the day. Would you have any hints or tips or resources for us in that situation?
Yeah, when you think about friendships, in the conversations I have with parents a lot of the time through primary school and into, secondary school, parents are thinking of friends as like your kind of close friends, your close circle. And kids don't develop those really easily over their younger years, really. Often when they're tiny, they're actually playing with whoever's playing the game they want. And the friendship groups from sort of grade 2 through ninth grade, through year 9, are often reasonably fluid. Now, some will find one or two people that they just gel with, and they're lucky. That's luckiness, really part of it. Um, but secondly, if you've got social skills difficulties as well, or you've got difficulties with reading other people, there's really specific skill development that can support that. Um, but the biggest piece of advice I often give parents is when you actually look at normal social development in terms of friendship development, not individual child social development, but if you look at the development of friendship over time, the close friends is what we're thinking of as parents when we say, oh, my child doesn't have enough friends. We're thinking of that best friend, that 2 or 3 kids that my kid can rely on, right? That's level 7 of friendship. So kids have got to have done the work to get their friends through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels before they can get to that really close friend. So I often say, let's start back at friendly greetings, because the more people that you're connecting with just at that friendly greeting level in the environments that you're in, the more likely it is you're going to build some sort of associative friendship, which is the next level, which is like, I'm in the same environment as you, but I choose you. So that's the child who's in the classroom and the teacher says you've got to work with a pair, and now I choose you to work with me, but I'm stuck in this environment anyway. So I have to choose somebody, or they're paired up and they actually have to work together. That's an example of that. Or the parent organises a play date, or they're friends with another family that's got kids the same age, and they end up playing together in that way. So they'll still be seen as friends, but it's more the environment that's orchestrated it. And then it goes to the next level of, I want to kind of see you outside of that context. And they start to find each other at lunchtime or after school, or, hey, so and so's playing footy. Can I play footy as well so that I can be with him on the weekend? And then it develops beyond that. So bringing it back and taking a breath and knowing that friendships are kind of fluid until at least about that year 9 level. And most kids don't really find their people till we get to year 10, year 11. They're core people that are going to be friends ongoing till they get to year 10, 11, and 12. And then also just build those skills, that foundational skills of this building connections with others, and um, the friendly greeting, so that we can build breadth in the group of people around you, so you can just start to work on one or two of those moving up the ladder.
And that's really helpful. And I know we have some listeners who are grandparents who do a lot of childcare, school pickups. They often bring to doctor's appointments, and so they're very hands-on. And then I know we also have some listeners who actually are the primary caregivers of the children. And I would love a little bit of support for those people, because I think they sometimes are really navigating a fine line, and as the grandparents you can maybe overstep a little bit or um upset people. Have you any advice around that situation? Because I know lots of people find that really hard to navigate.
I think there's so many benefits to having that multi-generational family involvement, but there is a lot of complexity to it, right? Which is what you're acknowledging. So I would always say consider what's best for the family and the child, because it's always going to be individualized. But I guess, again, I'm going to fall back on this values base, because I think if parents and grandparents, if we're or if people are co-parenting as well, um, if they can actually define some core values that are aligned with the way they want to parent. So they might have slightly different systems and rules, and kids can actually cope with that quite well. But if the core values are similar, or they're at least aligned, they sit sort of near each other, you're going to have a lot less conflict. So if parents can talk to their grandparent, their parents, or the grandparents can talk to the child's parents about what that looks like and what we agree to around these core values, or what we agree to is that, at Nana's house, this is going to fly. At home, it's not going to fly. And we're really clear about the way we communicate that to the kids. I actually think there's so much richness and opportunity in that sort of a setup. And I know as a parent, having that sort of external family support is such a relief, right? Especially because you are aligned a lot of the time, sometimes not. So you can be really aligned, or you can actually go, hey, I want time with the kids. So I'm going to fall into alignment with this idea while I'm looking after them, because I can see that's really important to you and you're important to me. So really, again, it's those open communication, talking about those values, talking about what that looks like in those settings, depending on what's happening, and also the resources of the people, because sometimes grandparents might not be, obviously, some might be really active. And so they might be really active and get involved in all the active stuff with the kids. Others might not be. Others might be really good at craft and might be teaching the kids to knit or to sew or to do something really cool with their hands, or play the piano, play an instrument, those sorts of things. Or they might come with a special skill as well. It's really cool. Or cooking, lots of the grandparents I work with as well, will teach old family recipes to kids, and kids love that stuff. So, um,
Yeah, I'm loving my mum teaches all the knitting and sewing, which I'm absolutely hopeless at. So that's great. I know we're nearly at the end of our time, but I just would love to ask you about time out and what you think about putting children on a step or a corner of the room to do time out. Is that something that you think that there's good evidence for? Obviously, Super Nanny, who's on TV, does a lot of naughty step or whatever she calls it now. And I just wondered what the thinking is around that strategy.
I guess I am more of an advocate for redirecting our kids for environmental supports that set them up for success, so preventing some of it to start with, environmental supports that set them up for more success. I am a user and an advocate for what I call time ins, not time out. So more that we're going to create space, a safe space for you to calm down and for you to be able to regulate. And there'll be tools in that space for you to be able to regulate. And again, the kids are part of that process to build those sorts of supports for them, that are individual to them. Because really, the neurobiology shows us that when kids are dysregulated, they can't problem solve, and they can't communicate with us at their best level. Probably is the best way to describe it, because it's so different over development, right? Anyone, if you're dysregulated, if you're feeling angry or you're feeling really frustrated, you can't think straight, right? As an adult. So poor little brain that hasn't yet fully developed. And I can tell you, those little brains are not fully developed till they're 25. So we're not just talking about little kids, we're also talking about teenagers. But creating that space where they can take a breath and they can regulate. And if they're little, you need to co-regulate for them. And even some of our primary school age kids will still need co-regulation. And every now and again, our teenagers will need a bit of co-regulation.
So what does that mean?
Which means that I'm a calm adult in your environment that's trusted, and I'm bringing that calmness into you. So that means that if the parent wants to use that tool, they need to be able to have their own tools to bring the calm. And then I'm going to just sit with you, or I'm just going to say, hey, let's go shoot hoops. And we just stand there and do that rhythmic movement. Or let's go for a walk together, is what I often do with teenagers in the high school environment. let's go for a walk. And we just walk next to each other. And after a little while, kids will calm and they'll start talking to me about what's going on. You kind of have to have routines again to build that ability to regulate. So time out, the idea is that fun stops before, we need to solve the problem before we come in, but it's not a really connected way to do that. And all the research I've read around the neurobiology of this sort of stuff that's going on for the kids is that we have to do it in a connected space if we want them to learn to do it themselves independently down the track.
Yeah, that's been so helpful. I know, Suzie, I'm going to want to have you back to ask you hundreds of more questions. You've been absolutely amazing. We haven't even really got near um, screen time and the terrible twos and all those things. So I hope at some point you would agree to coming back on. This has been really so helpful. Um, can I ask you how we will obviously put it on the show notes, but for anyone who's in their car listening as they're out for a walk, how can they find you?
So I'm on Facebook with it's called The Wonderful Society, our Facebook page, and we have a Parent Century, which is a closed group in there as well, where I do quite a bit of lives, and there's actually the video guide for my book and those sorts of things in there in that closed book, and it's called the Parent Century for parents with kids with big emotions. And The Wonderful Society on Facebook and Instagram. And I'm also on LinkedIn now as well as Suzie Forbes. So if parents want to connect with me. And then if they want to get the book, it's a bit.ly link. So it's the bit.ly, so it's bit.ly and then the slash, and it's then stop-fighting-now-book. So they can get that, but that'll be in the show notes anyway. So
Amazing. Can I ask you one final question?
of course.
What piece of advice would you give 20-something Suzie?
I'd say trust your instincts. They're good and you are more than enough. Because I really didn't discover that I was enough until probably the last 10 years. And what a waste of, a good 40 odd years of my life. Just me second guessing myself all that time.
Suzie, thank you so much. That has been absolutely wonderful. I genuinely really will want to talk to you more.
Yeah, there's plenty more in the vault, I'll tell you.
I think you'll agree we've had some incredible guests on the podcast already, and today's was no exception. I think there is so many nuggets of information I'd love to get out there. So if you know someone who would benefit from the podcast, please share it. That way more people can learn all about themselves. Remember, this podcast is all about you. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or other professional advice. Information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you have any health concerns, always consult your doctor.